It's a long name. But we work to end incarceration of women and girls and create community led alternatives, which is an infrastructure we call reimagining communities, which is all about investing in communities and investing in building and empowering women and girls and people of the community that is over incarcerated, under resourced, and always misrepresented in most cases. So I'm really excited. Our infrastructure will not only create a safe space and also get us to the goal of ending incarceration of women and girls by stopping the flow of women and girls from even entering prisons, because we will have the community resources we need to provide treatment, mental health, substance use, housing, and all the things women and girls need, so that way we don't cause harm to others or ourselves. But we will also be creating a safe space for women coming home, which Lola talked about through clemency and medical parole and all the great things, because we know prisons and jails, there's no place for women to really heal or advance or get to the root issues of why women and girls are even in prison in the first place. And we're just trying to explore what different looks like. So I'm really excited for this presentation, and I'm not going to take too long because I can go on about this all day, but I want to learn, and I'll pass it back over to Lola.
Thanks, Ashi. I'll turn it to Dr. Feingold, and she will take us the rest of the way.
Okay, I am going to start my PowerPoint. Share this with you, and let me go to, I just want to start my, all right, so slideshow, here we go. So yeah, my tech skills, you guys. I need one of my kids here. So anyway, good afternoon, and thank you so much for attending this presentation. We're going to be talking about the relationship between postpartum mental illness and the judicial system, and specifically psychosis and depression when crimes are the result of maternal mental illness. And I'll be giving you an overview about maternal mental illness and explaining how our US laws are such a complete mismatch for these mental illnesses and why the laws need to be changed. In understanding maternal mental illness, I'm hoping it will help you as you represent the attorneys in the audience, that you represent these women when crimes are the result of their mental illness. So a few brief comments about my bio and Dr. Spinelli's bio. We've both been in practice a long time, and I've been specializing in reproductive mental health and treating women with perinatal, meaning pregnancy and postpartum, mental health disorders for almost 3 decades, long time. But this is kind of a summary of my advocacy work and some of the work that's most relevant to this particular presentation. I am proud to say I'm a member of the Postpartum Support International Advisory Council and the Postpartum Psychosis Task Force, among other things I'm involved with, and my clinical practice. So in 2017, I'd been doing clinical work for obviously a long time, but in 2017, I began my advocacy work, working alongside with my partner, attorney Barry Lewis. We both helped to shepherd a postpartum psychosis and depression legislation through the Illinois legislature. It became, I'm proud to say, it became the first postpartum criminal law in Illinois and in the United States in 2018. And we were asked to write a book about our experiences, how it started, and the history of that. And not only is that contained in my book, I'll talk a little bit about it when we get to the law. So that is our book. And now I would also like to introduce my esteemed colleague and friend, also Dr. Meg Spinelli. She's recognized as a major influential figure in terms of postpartum and perinatal expert, reproductive expert, both nationally and internationally. She's been an expert witness on many high-profile cases. And this is a very brief summary of her accomplishments. I mean, we could spend the rest of the presentation talking about them, but I want you to have the benefit of hearing from her wealth of knowledge and information. And this is Dr. Spinelli's book concerning the subject matter that we'll be discussing. So first, I'd like to show you some behavioral objectives. we'll be going over this for the next hour or so. And hopefully we have time for resources and questions and answers and all that. I'll try to talk fast. But I will begin with the basics about maternal mental illness, discuss the impact of mental health problems and the disparity for women of color, and then move to the law. And Dr. Spinelli will cover expert witness testimony, some of her work with that, her work regarding working with a group and adding postpartum psychosis to the DSM, which is the diagnostic, basically Bible of all kinds of mental health conditions. And we are wanting to add that. And Dr. Spinelli has been forefront in that, leading that charge. And she'll also be covering some neurobiology about these mentally ill women. So let's get started, and let's start with some facts about maternal mental illness. And hopefully you can see these slides, and our faces aren't covering these up as they are on my computer. But anyway, maternal mental health disorders are the most common complications of pregnancy and childbirth. And that is surprising to some people who think in terms of gestational diabetes or preeclampsia and other kinds of health problems, but mental health conditions are the most common. 800,000 American families are affected by PMAD, which is perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, and we'll be talking about that each year. And that's 1 in 5 pregnant or new mothers. And suicide and overdose combined are the leading cause of death for new mothers. Pretty concerning facts. And we know that, especially those of us who've had children, that being let me see if I can, whoops, why is sorry about that. I want to move to the next slide. And for some reason, there we go. Next slide says it all. Being a mother to an infant or a baby is not easy. And here's a few pictures to remind you if you haven't had kids in years. And this is in cases where there isn't mental illness, and how much more difficult it is when you're trying to navigate having a new child, a baby, along with dealing with mental illness. So moving along, I want to talk a little bit about maternal mortality and the disparities for women of color. So what we know is that women die in childbirth in the United States at up to 3 times the rate of other developed countries. Very concerning. And Black women are more than 3 times as likely to die from pregnancy-related complications as white women, regardless of their income level or their education. And this is coming from the White House Proclamation on Black Maternal Health. Moving on to looking at maternal mental health disparities, women of color experience maternal mental health conditions at 2 to 3 times the rate of white women, and yet they are half as likely to receive help. So that needs to change. I think we're all aware that there needs to be, and there's been more of a push for this to happen. It's just not acceptable. And we know the citation is underneath that Black women Asian women, Native American, Hawaiian, Alaska Native, and multiracial women were less likely to be screened for postpartum depression compared to white women. Thus, one reason why they're not receiving the help and are struggling. Women on Medicare and Medicaid were also less likely to be screened for postpartum depression compared to women with private insurance. And these are all women that are going to be at higher risk because of poverty, because of discrimination, because of health problems, and yet they're less likely to be screened and certainly also less likely to get treatment. And that is, I think we can all agree that's altogether wrong. So I'm going to move on now to a broad overview of maternal mental illness. And then we'll be focusing on postpartum psychosis as the most severe maternal mental illness and the most associated with tragedies and crimes that you may encounter as an attorney. So we're going to start with baby blues, which number one, if there's any take-home message, baby blues is not, I underline, a mental illness, and it's not to be confused, despite what you read sometimes in the headlines, it's not to be confused with postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis, but it is an emotional reaction, and it's a normal reaction to the hormonal changes following childbirth. How do we know that? 75 to 80% of women experience it, and it's sort of transient mood changes, could be crying, sadness, irritability, anxiousness. It occurs usually fairly quickly after delivery, within the first few days to first few weeks. When it goes beyond that, then we have to look at, is this really something more than that? But again, it's something transient, comes and goes all by itself. So women don't need treatment, they don't need intervention, but they do need to know so they're not afraid that this can happen and often does happen to women. So now let's move on to the continuum of maternal mental illness. And, we talked about, or I mentioned PMAD, or perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. And that is, what that refers to is how we describe, it's sort of an umbrella term for all the mental health issues that occur during pregnancy and during the postpartum period, perinatal being pregnancy and postpartum. So this umbrella term encompasses depression, anxiety, panic disorder, obsessive thoughts, obsessive compulsive disorder, and women who have trauma and have postpartum PTSD. But because we're focusing on these crimes and the law, we're not going to talk about the anxiety and the panic attacks and all that for this presentation. We're going to focus on depression and psychosis. So postpartum depression is something that affects 10 to 15% of women. Sometimes we even say 10 to 20%. The symptoms are similar to a major depression that occurs in the non-postpartum period. This is something that requires treatment and intervention. And the earlier we identify this, the sooner people can get treatment. And in fact, it responds very well to treatment. And treatment is either psychotherapy, particularly if it's a moderate episode, or if it's more severe, oftentimes it's a combination of medication and psychotherapy. So let's look at the symptom picture of postpartum depression. So again, what you might expect with depression, depressed or sad moods. It can be anger and irritability. There is a loss of appetite for many women, or difficulty sleeping, or maybe they're sleeping all the time, but more often we see that they have difficulty sleeping. I see someone wants to get in. Oh, Okay, I guess someone else took care of that. So sleep disturbances, the lack of pleasure, the lack of joy and interest in things used to enjoy is a core symptom of a clinical depression. We call it anhedonia. And clinical depressions, that's kind of what we look for, even more so than crying, is sort of, you don't feel like yourself, nothing interests you anymore. It can come with feelings of guilt, shame, hopelessness, and worthlessness. And that hopelessness puts you sometimes at risk to feel like you don't want to live this way, and having suicidal ideation that can be part of it. So, so that's postpartum depression. Now I want to give you a little take-home poll to test your knowledge of what is postpartum psychosis. What do you know? How much do you know? And then, of course, I'll be answering these questions for you. You can write it down or just think about it in your head. So postpartum psychosis affects how many women in the US each year? Answers: 1 to 2 in 1,000, 1 in 100, 3 to 4 in 100,000. Second question: suicide and infanticide risk is greatly increased with psychiatric disorders such as postpartum psychosis. True or false? And you can probably imagine the answer to that. And third, women with postpartum psychosis are more likely to get a lenient sentence when a crime is committed due to the insanity defense. And you'd think the answer would be, of course, but the answer in fact is no. They're less likely to get a lenient a lenient sentence, and they have more difficulty. I think attorneys have more difficulty with the insanity defense for these women. And as we start to talk about it, you'll see why that is. So next, let's look at the global prevalence of maternal mental illness, and you'll also get the answers to some of these questions. So when we look at global prevalence, which isn't very different than in the US, it's all part of the same. The worldwide prevalence of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders, or PMAD, is 10 to 15% of childbearing women. Postpartum psychosis, here's the answer to that poll, affects 1 to 2 in 1,000 women. And while the incident rates might seem low, the impact can be devastating. And so tragic cases leading to suicide occur in 4 to 5% of the women with postpartum psychosis, and cases of infanticide or filicide occur in 1 to 4% of women with postpartum psychosis. So let's look at the signs and symptoms of postpartum psychosis. And what we see is these women, this is a temporary mental illness, and these women are, really acting differently than what they were. It's really a break from reality that comes following childbirth. And so the symptoms can include seeing, hearing, smelling, and feeling things that aren't there. In other words, visual, auditory, tactile, and olfactory hallucinations, bizarre and delusional beliefs, things like religious beliefs come up, feeling like your baby is Satan and it's your job to rid the world of Satan. Paranoia that other people are talking about you, or sometimes those kind of hallucinations where you're hearing voices coming from the TV or giving you messages. But in terms of the beliefs, also can be grandiose beliefs, thinking you have super abilities, and altruistic, which is very interesting because sometimes we see in some of these cases, as odd as it seems, that women who do take the life of their child have this it comes under an altruistic belief. In other words, they believe that by taking the life of their child, this will save their child. I know it sounds crazy, but that's part of psychosis. So they might feel that they're saving their child from a worse fate, such as hell or Satan, or in one case, a woman truly believed that by taking the life of her autistic child, they would be reborn normally. And to those of us who don't understand psychosis, of course, it sounds odd, but that is psychosis. So other symptoms, disorganized thoughts and behavior, and certainly difficulty communicating clearly, either unrelated ideas, sometimes rapid speech, excessive hyperactivity, sort of that manic activity, maybe seeing pacing, for instance. And another kind of core thing that we look for is a decreased need for sleep, which is so odd for exhausted new mothers. But these women have tons of energy because they're manic. So they might not have slept for days or weeks, and they feel like they've got tons of energy. Confusion and disorientation, and sort of an alternating depression and mania, or just manic state that come with these illnesses. Let's take a look at sort of a broad overview and of these illnesses. So again, as I said, it's a temporary mental illness, a break from reality, and it's associated with bipolar disorder. And for many of these women, it's sometimes their first manic episode and first break from reality that comes following childbirth. So it's an acute onset of a severe psychotic or manic symptoms after childbirth. Again, prevalence, to answer that question, we'll keep repeating it, probably is it affects 1 to 2 out of 1,000 women. It usually occurs fairly quickly after childbirth, but it can occur during pregnancy or later in the postpartum period. And that's why when laws talk about postpartum psychosis, we look at the whole first year. This is another important take-home message. Postpartum psychosis is a crisis situation. There is need for these women are stable for the safety of themselves and their baby and others. They are not obviously in the right mind, and so they're not accountable and responsible for their actions are not rational. Distinguishing features, a complete shift from their previous normal functioning. Again, some of the other things I've said before, like the beliefs being off, paranoid or delusional about the baby or others. What's very important, and I think you have to be aware of, especially in these cases when they come out in the legal system and people go to trial, is that postpartum psychosis has a feature that's waxing and waning, meaning can come and go. So it can look like malingering. They can at one point be, going for their postpartum check, and their doctor thinks they're doing great. And an hour later, they're talking to someone who isn't there, or they're seeing things that aren't there. So symptoms can wax and wane, and that makes it particularly difficult at times when you're trying to defend these women and for other people to see that they're really mentally ill, because at certain times they may seem lucid and clear. So let's talk about some facts about the prevalence. So what we know is that 50% of the women with postpartum psychosis have no prior history of mental illness. And when we talked about why it's hard to get in the insanity defense and defend these women, for some people, it's that's certainly something that I think when you're trying to defend these women, it helps toward the insanity defense to have a long mental health history, and yet half of these women have never had mental health problems before and have never had treatment before. And so they're really blindsided by this illness, and it can devastate them and their family. Here's another fact that's pretty scary and shocking. Who knew that having a baby puts you at the highest risk for psychosis in your life? That's something that could help with birth control. But anyway, a woman is 23 times more likely to experience psychosis in the month following childbirth than at any other time of her life. A very concerning fact, but true. Let's talk about risk factors a little bit. So who's at risk? Well, as we've said, as I've said, for 50% of these women, there is no identifiable risk because there's no history of mental illness. But certainly if they have psychiatric problems like bipolar disorder or major mental illness, or a personal history that they've had postpartum psychosis with their first child, they're at higher risk, 50%, of having it with subsequent childbirth and pregnancies. If this runs in their family, or psychosis or bipolar runs in their family, again, that puts them at higher risk, and in a perfect world would be screening for all of these things so that we could be monitoring and watching these women. So let's for a second turn back to talking about women of color and postpartum psychosis, and how much do we know about that? And unfortunately, we don't know much. We have to do more. We have to do more research in this area. I talked to colleagues at Mass General and at Northwestern, and basically what I was told is these are great questions, but that it really hasn't been adequately pursued. Some people say that women of color have the same incidence as other women, white women, for postpartum psychosis, and other people say they're at higher risk. And so there is need for more research in terms of prevalence, the risk of suicide and infanticide in women of color. And one of my colleagues made a very good point, which was that research needs to control for socioeconomic status and other factors, and that we should not be lumping minorities, Blacks, Asians, Hispanics together, and other minority populations shouldn't be lumped together in research when we're looking at some of this. So we've got a lot to learn, and a lot of research needs to be done. But what we do know is that there are high stakes of postpartum psychosis. And this is what the research does tell us, and this is concerning. So we certainly want to identify women early and get them to the hospital, get them treatment so that there aren't tragedies, because that's what, of course, all of us want. This is a quote that is from Christina Delaney. Hopefully, maybe she's even watching. And hi, Christina. Christina Delaney is one of our colleagues. She's the founder of the Tennessee non-for-profit organization Cherished Mom, and she's a postpartum psychosis survivor herself. And she said, and I think we can all agree, women, families, and care providers are often blindsided by this illness. Our greatest tool in the fight to save lives is through education and awareness. And this is a picture of Christina with her beautiful children. And she also, here's another quote by her: not seeking help and feeling societal pressure to be the put together mom almost cost me everything. With no mental health history, so she was one of those without a mental health history, postpartum psychosis blindsided me and my family. I spent 2 weeks in the psych unit battling for my mind and my life. And now she is helping other women and has started a great nonprofit and doing some really amazing work. Thanks, Christina. So I'm going to move on and talk about the intersection, or about the relationship between postpartum mental illness and the criminal justice system when tragedies occur. So the big message is, I think we can all agree that we have to educate, we have to increase awareness of maternal mental illness and the consequences of undiagnosed and untreated maternal mental illness and mental illness in the United States. First, I'd like to say a few things in general about incarceration and then move on back to maternal mental health. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with him and the book, but I was very influenced reading the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, if you're familiar with him. And Attorney Stevenson founded the Equal Justice Initiative. It's a legal practice dedicated to defending the poor and the wrongfully condemned in our criminal justice system. And his book was made into a film, in fact. So, but if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend you read it. And he wrote the book in 2014, but I think what he says is really still significant. He says, quote, "Today, we have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The prison population has increased from 300,000 people in the early 70s, to 2.3 million today. For years, we've been the only country in the world that condemns children to life imprisonment without parole. Nearly 3,000 juveniles have been sentenced to die in prison." Oh, sorry about that. I think that was my 5-minute bell. I'll try to wrap it up in 5 or so minutes. Anyway, that was written in 2014. So what are the numbers today? Well, some facts about the prison population in 2022. While the US represents 4 to 5% of the world's population, about 20% of the world's total prison population is in the United States. Unbelievable. Anyway, the percent of people serving life in without parole or virtual life sentences who are Black are 48% or more, with other minorities right in there as well. This is from prisonpolicy.org. And now I'm going to just move back to talking about postpartum psychosis, because what we know is postpartum psychosis, even though there's cases that don't lead to this, it has been linked to infanticide and filicide cases throughout the world. And women with postpartum psychosis involved with the criminal justice system in the US have difficulty both receiving treatment and getting a fair trial. Enacting postpartum criminal laws is paramount for improved outcomes when postpartum psychosis results in tragedies like infanticide and filicide. And some quick facts about crimes related to postpartum psychosis. In my home state, there are approximately 20 or more women in prison due to crimes suffering from that were committed while suffering from postpartum psychosis. In the US, we estimate about 1,000 women who are in prison due to postpartum psychosis related filicide, and attorneys have been reluctant, which is one reason we're doing this presentation. They've been reluctant to represent women who commit infanticide and filicide. We also know fathers can commit these crimes, but we haven't even touched on that, and won't have time today, but that might be a future topic. So why is that? Well, there's a fundamental failure, and Dr. Spinelli will be talking more about this, in the judicial system that doesn't accept the medical science of perinatal illnesses. This is not true in countries where this is not true in other countries where there's acceptance and there's mitigation in the law for women with maternal mental illnesses. Why is there a failure? Well, in the US, women with postpartum psychosis who commit crimes like filicide receive longer lifetime prison sentences, or unfortunately, even the death penalty in some states for this temporary mental illness. In the UK and over 30 developed countries, these women get treatment, psychiatric treatment, and rehabilitation. In 1922, in fact, the UK abolished the death penalty for women who commit filicide in the year following birth. And in 1938, they expanded that law for mothers who commit filicide or infanticide, not out of malice, but out of mental illness in the year following birth. That's called the British Infanticide Act. So why is there a failure? Well, there's lack of compassion and mercy in the United States. It's treated very harshly here, and mainly because there's a lack of education. These women are viewed in very black and white terms as baby killers, as monsters, and that's vastly different from other countries. In fact, there's no consistency from state to state or even from case to case. 4 states in the US have no insanity defense: Kansas, Montana, Idaho, and Utah. So many countries, in fact, do recognize postpartum illnesses as different. And these are, just, you can take a look, a smattering of some of those countries. At this point, we think there are about 37 countries that have laws regarding infanticide and understanding this differently than we do. So I'd like to just end with a little bit about the Illinois law, and then we'll hear from Dr. Spinelli. So the Illinois law that passed, that I talked to you about at the beginning, that I was honored to shepherd through the legislature, what it is it's a groundbreaking law in Illinois that amends the Code of Corrections to consider postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis as mitigating factors in sentencing and post-conviction when crimes are committed by women suffering from these illnesses. It started out as, it passed as a law as 100-0574 and then was modified to be 101-411. No other state has such a law. Texas did try in 2009, but didn't pass. There are strengths and limitations to the law. The strengths are, it's the first law in the US, and it's a great model for other states, and it allows incarcerated women a chance for resentencing. The limitations are, it wasn't tied to treatment or a mental health conditional release program. It doesn't allow for the state's minimum sentence, which unfortunately in Illinois is 20 years. And there are stipulations that it didn't come up before at trial. So what I would like to acknowledge is that this law, which is sort of amazing, and again, we tell the story in our book, but this law started out as House Bill 1764, and it was written by 2 incarcerated women who had life in prison and no parole, Sims and Jackson, and they were at Logan Correctional Center. And Sims did have postpartum psychosis and had committed infanticide. Jackson had not, but they were instrumental and started the whole process. And now other states are beginning to introduce postpartum legislation, but it's a slow process. So Massachusetts has introduced legislation. It was in the Judicial Committee. In fact, I testified, but it did not pass this time around, but I had been told by the sponsors it will be reintroduced in the Commonwealth in the next session. And as you can see, it is more comprehensive than Illinois. We're going to just skip these and finish up. Also, there are interest in other states like Colorado, and I've been recently contacted by Minnesota advocates that are interested in a law. Our goal is to have every state be more aligned with the UK, and to finish up some successful outcomes since our Illinois law. Sims, who initially wrote the law, has been released. She's been out of prison for 6 months. She was in prison for 32 years, a prison sentence with no parole. And I was honored to be an expert witness law with Dr. Diane Sanford at her clemency, which followed with the prisoner review board. And a few weeks after that, a few weeks ago, another woman has come up with who will be released. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge Calandra Hewlett, who benefited from this law, and there are other women as well. That was she was the first woman, and this is a smiling Calandra. And I'm probably out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Spinelli, because I know she has a lot of education to impart. Thank you, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Spinelli.
Thank you. My talk today is about the failure of both psychiatry and the law, and their failure to provide justice for women with postpartum psychosis. Next. The diagnosis of postpartum psychosis was first identified in 4000 BC, but Louis Victor Marseille was the first physician to write a treatise of about 70 women back in 1858. And where he writes, where subjects are predisposed to mental illness, pregnancy, delivery, and lactation can have disastrous repercussions. Next, please. This is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, first edition. We call it the DSM-1. And what I'm going to tell you about is the troubling discrimination that kept postpartum psychosis out of the DSM-1. If you are not a formal diagnosis, or if the illness is not a formal diagnosis, in here, it is not considered an illness in psychiatry. Next, please. So it was never included in the first edition. In fact, the terms postpartum, puerperal, and all of their synonyms were eliminated from the terminology of American psychiatry. Next, please. Postpartum psychosis is a rare disease, and it's placed in an with orphanet diseases in the literature. And because it's so rare and it's omitted from the DSM, there has been a lack of education, a lack of symptom identification and proper treatment, and a lack of defense in the courtroom. Next, please. It has devastating effects on families, and of course, on the women who it affects. This is from Cindy W.'s sister-in-law. Cindy was an attorney in New York who was clerking for a Supreme Court judge. She had an episode of postpartum psychosis, and she jumped off her apartment building, and with her baby Bjorn on her and her little one inside of the baby Bjorn. And Karen writes, "We lost my husband's sister almost 9 years ago when she took her life and tried to take her baby's life. He survived. Postpartum psychosis has affected our family's lives forever. Cindy took her life due to postpartum psychosis. We as family had never even heard of postpartum psychosis, so we weren't able to get her the right help. And her psychiatrist didn't know anything about it, so they didn't provide the right help. If we all had known, maybe she would still be with us today, and our son would have a mom." This was my attempt to get some private stories to give it to the DSM committee, because I've been working on getting the DSM to getting postpartum psychosis into the DSM. Next, please. Next, please. Okay. Psychosis occurring during the purporium. Purporium means during pregnancy or postpartum. This was a journal article written in 1926. Next, please. Next, oh, thank you. And it was written by two psychiatrists, Strecker and Ebau. And they concluded in their paper that purple psychosis is not a clinical entity. There is no such thing as postpartum psychosis. Now, these two people, psychiatrists, lacked expertise in this subject. And they did a retrospective review of 50 charts of women with postpartum psychosis. They never met or evaluated these patients. This publication had enormous influence on American psychiatry. Next, please. So, one would think, where would this kind of discrimination come from and why? But looking at Strecker's work in the literature, this is a paper that he wrote entitled Motherhood and Momism, Effect on a Nation. Next, please. Strecker's bias is obvious in this publication. He writes, mothers are a threat to our survival, and describes the alarming number of young American soldiers with psychoneuroses, what we call today PTSD, created by the unwillingness of the American mom to grant emotional emancipation during childhood. The threat to our society must not be allowed to go further. Next, please. So after this, there were a series of American authors that argued against a clinical entity associated with childbearing. And unfortunately, general psychiatry stood with them, and purple psychosis was expunged from the nomenclature. Basically, there is no difference between postpartum illnesses or any others. Next, please. And so the papers that followed went like this. This is David Boyd's paper, Mental Disorders Associated with Childbearing, 1947. He described the causes of postpartum psychosis as poor personality organization or marriage to a shiftless, unstable husband, deviated personality, alcoholism, illegitimacy. Next, please. And so they all amounted to things for which the woman could be blamed for this illness. Meyerson wrote a hideous article called The Nervousness of the Jew in the Journal of Mental Hygiene. Meyerson's hospital cases comprised a large number of Jewish women. The general hospital admission rate was 18%. Admission for purple psychosis was 36% or twice as much. And he opined, from the angle of mental stability, Jewish women tend to be upset by childbirth. Next, please. Strecker continued this anti-postpartum campaign. And because of it, it dominated the official thinking about postpartum illness. He was able to obtain a position on the APA committee, which sponsored the first DSM in 1952. And the word postpartum was expunged from the DSM and the psychiatric nomenclature. Next, please. The consequences that postpartum disorder does not exist is that we have uneducated psychiatrists who are unable to diagnose. They make poor treatment decisions. There is a lack of research, uneducated public, lack of recognition in the courtroom as a mental illness, and of course, no prevention of suicide and infanticide. Next, please. This fallacy follows us. when I was in medical school between 1984 and 1988, it doesn't seem like a long time ago, but I went to medical school late because I was a nurse for 15 years prior. And I'm really sorry about this. I'm sorry. Ugh. For 15 years prior. And so when I went to medical school, I knew that this was what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with mothers with psychiatric illness. I'm sorry, that is the house line. And so I told one of the senior faculty at Cornell, it wasn't just any medical school, that this is what I wanted to do. And he told me that there wasn't such a thing in psychiatry. I had a very hard time believing this because I did know that it was studied in the United Kingdom and other places. Next, please. And so I went to London in my last year of medical school to learn about perinatal psychiatry. And I just want to read you, this was another vignette from a brave and resilient woman who describes her experience, which represent the stories of so many. I had a severe case of postpartum psychosis, and I didn't get the appropriate diagnosis, treatment, medications, or help until it was almost too late. I finally got a proper diagnosis after I tragically attempted to take the life of my son. Thankfully, he survived with no lasting injury. My experience with postpartum psychosis has drastically changed the course of my life, as I spent 9 months in a state hospital, underwent a criminal trial, lost my job as a pediatric intensive care nurse at a prestigious Boston hospital, lost my marriage and also custody of my children. After years of hard work, I am finally working again, have regained custody of my children, and am now a postpartum psychosis coordinator for Postpartum Support International. Please add the diagnosis of postpartum psychosis to the DSM so that women who suffer from this terrible illness can get the help and treatment that they desperately need. Thank you. Next, please. Postpartum psychosis is a psychiatric emergency. We who work in this field know this. And as soon as we find any woman with a postpartum psychosis, the first thing you want to do is to separate her from her baby because of the possibility of infanticide, and she needs to be hospitalized immediately as well. Next, please. As Dr. Feingold said, suicide is the leading cause of maternal death in the first year after childbirth. Postpartum psychosis has a rate of 5%. The methods are usually irreversible and aggressive, such as self-incineration, jumping, or gunshot. This is unusual because those methods are often men's methods of suicide, where overdose is more likely for women, but with these women, the overdose is only 3% of the population who kill themselves. Next, please. Infanticide in the United States. We have the highest rate of infanticide in the Western world, 8 per 100,000 infants. England and Wales is 4.5 per 100,000, Canada 3 per 100,000. So the question we have to ask ourselves, is it because we haven't trained physicians, nurses, and others to identify and treat these illnesses appropriately? I would venture to say yes, but it furthers the question of why we can't make any kind of changes in this. Next, please. I just wanted to clarify this nomenclature. Infanticide is infant death, murder under 1 year. Usually in women with postpartum psychosis. Neonaticide is death before 24 hours after delivery. This is very different. It's usually by women who may deny their pregnancy. And you will hear that an infant was found in a trash can. That is very different also from postpartum psychosis. Filicide is child murder. It's a general term for child murder. Next, please. We have very contrasting views, both in identification and legislation, not only in the UK versus the United States, but in other countries. Next, please. As you heard, there's just about over 30 countries that have particular infanticide laws. Legislation in the United States, these women are charged with homicide, many are serving life in prison, and one in Texas has been on death row for many years. Next, please. To give you an example of the Infanticide Act, these women receive a reduced penalty from murder to manslaughter because of the mental vulnerability due to the effects of childbirth, with a time limit of 1 year from birth. Because the balance of her mind was disturbed by not having fully recovered from birth. But she is just not left on her own. She has mandated psychiatric treatment. So these women receive treatment instead of punishment. Next, please. And the thing is, there's no difference between the victims, the perpetrators, or the rapes in countries that have a provision for infanticide and those who don't. So Scotland has no provision for infanticide. England's had an infanticide law for 90 years, but there's no difference in the rates, characteristics of victims and perpetrators. Treatment is as effective as incarceration. And of course, that makes it cost effective as well. Next. My main problem there are many problems, as you all probably know, in the courtroom, but a major problem with mental illness in the courtroom is that I think that psychiatry is seen as a very weak science or field. Because postpartum psychosis and mental illness is not about Freud. Postpartum psychosis, infanticide, they are not due to some unconscious wish from Freudian therapy. Postpartum psychosis is a biological illness. And I believe that every psychiatrist or psychologist who goes into the courtroom must be knowledgeable about these biologic underpinnings. Next, please. I'm going to explain them to you, and I don't want you to feel that you have to have every idea digested from this, but if you will just get the general picture, I think you will understand what I mean. This was a very large study of 54,000 births over 12 years. This was a study where Kendall, he matched admission rates for psychiatric hospitals to the years of birth for women in Edinburgh. And he looked at all of the data from 2 years before until 2 years after. And what he found was there was this very large increase in admissions to psychiatric hospital for women with postpartum psychosis. in the first 4 weeks and out to 3 months. Next, please. So we know there's something going on there in childbirth that must be causing this. So what it is hormones. If you think about hormones, this is the first trimester, second trimester, third. Okay. In the beginning, the hormones estrogen and progesterone are down to 0. Over the 40 weeks of pregnancy, these hormones go up hundreds of fold. Now imagine, then within 24 hours, the hormones are back to 0. And I'll explain how this happens. Next, please. Circulating hormones act on the brain. They modify both the structure and the chemistry of the brain. Next, please. So here is a picture of the brain. These are the brain chemicals that can become altered and cause psychiatric symptoms. And here, it's in yellow, it's hard to see, is the amygdala. The amygdala processes emotions. The next picture is going to scare you away, but it scares me away still as well. Please go to the next slide. This is something called the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, HPO. And what it does, it's a way that the brain is connected to the glands, specifically the ovaries. And this axis is responsible for development and reproduction. Next, please. See, time is going fast, so I will try to speed this up. This is another picture of the HPO axis. And it's really only 3 glands, which basically are pushing each other to expel other hormones. And so the anterior pituitary is encouraging estrogen and progesterone, okay, over here, to be released by the ovaries. But estrogen and progesterone will have a feedback to the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus has the same feedback here. So with that being confusing, I hope you can at least see, basically, the brain connects to the reproductive system and to the ovaries. Next, please. This is my image of this mechanism at birth. At childbirth, the woman has collected all of the hormones in the placenta. And what I said before about the 24 hours, within 24 hours, the placenta is gone, and as are all of the hormones. Now remember, that change through the mechanism of the HPO goes back to the brain. And for women who are vulnerable to psychiatric illness, they will become psychotic. And I hope that wasn't too confusing. Next slide, please. Just to support further biological underpinnings, there is an elevated immune response with women with postpartum psychosis. Next, please. Postpartum psychosis in bipolar women, of course, both the bipolar and the postpartum psychosis can be hereditary. Next, please. In addition, there are similar genetic patterns in women with postpartum psychosis. Next, please. And all of this comes down to this picture puzzle. We call it a picture puzzle of postpartum psychosis because it's not just about psychotic symptoms. It's a very confusing picture of one, a bipolar cyclical mood disorder, psychosis, as Dr. Feingold explained, but something also called cognitive disorganization psychosis. And so there is often a delirium-like picture, which makes it more difficult for her and more dangerous for her because of her disorientation and confusion. Next, please. Just quickly, in the DSM-4, somebody decided to put the word postpartum in. They thought, well, you can just stick postpartum in after any diagnosis and say the onset is within 4 weeks after delivery of the child. We'll put in the word postpartum as a specifier. Next slide. So it can be applied to almost any illness. The problem is the symptomatology of a postpartum diagnosis does differ from non-postpartum symptoms, just as I showed you with the other psychosis. Next, please. This is an old case, but important. And it's about the failure of society. Next, please. Psychiatry and the United States legislation in the case of Andrea Yates. Next, please. Andrea Yates was an extraordinary mother, registered nurse, an honor student. She married Rusty Yates, who was a fundamentalist. Between 1994 and 2001, she had 5 children, 1 miscarriage, and she was breastfeeding, lactating in between all. Just remember what I said about hormones. Her hormones never normalized. With childbirth, she spiraled downwards with each child. Next, please. On June 20th, 6 months postpartum with her 5th child, she had continued to see cameras in the ceiling because she was still psychotic from the previous pregnancy. She was discharged twice from the hospital while psychotic. Again, remember what I'm saying about the lack of education in the medical system. She felt the presence of Satan, who directed her to kill her 5 children in order to save them from hell. And so she drowned them in the bathtub of her Houston, Texas home. She laid them on the bed with their arms around each other for their journey to heaven. Because in her psychotic mind, she was being a good mother. Next, please. A little bit of the history. The events before that, she had been hospitalized, discharged on haloperidol, which is an antipsychotic, and 2 mood stabilizers. On June 6th, her psychiatrist decided that she had a depression, but not psychosis. And so he removed the antipsychotic Haldol and told her to think positive. Next, please. So the question is, how did we fail her? Well, she was psychotic for 2 years before this postpartum period when it became worse. There was no child safety provided for her. Friends saw through the window that Andrea was crawling around the house like a caged animal with her little one in her arms. It was known that she was a psychotic mother who was homeschooling, and yet Child Protective Services were never called in. Next, please. The medical community never connected the fact that she had bipolar disorder in her family and that she had this childbearing history between 1994 and 2001. And the management, she had an incorrect diagnosis and a premature hospital discharge. Next, please. And there was a failure to demonstrate, and there is in all of these trials, that the prosecuting psychiatrist has any expertise in perinatal psychiatry. Next, please. And so when Andrea had her court case, we had our archaic insanity defense, McNaughton defense, which I will speak about. There was an unqualified witness who made false statements. He said that she had copycatted an episode of Law and Order in which a woman drowned her children and got off on the insanity defense. Now, right after that statement, NBC and others called in to say that that had never ran. So that show was never on. She could never have seen it. But this witness said that he was a consultant to the show. The other way that the judicial failed her was that she had a death qualified jury, which I was told was not aware of possible psychiatric hospitalization. Next, please. So in August, she was found competent to stand trial. The death penalty jury was selected. After only 3.5 hours, the verdict was guilty. And 35-minute deliberation, she received life in prison. Although they saw it as a capital crime, it was likely done because of the failed testimony of the prosecuting psychiatrist. Next, please. So this is our McNaughton law. In every article that you read of postpartum psychosis, there is discussion about cognitive implications and cognitive disorganization of the postpartum psychotic mother. And so if the psychiatrist goes in and asks her, Ms. Yates, did you understand that what you were doing was wrong at the time of the crime? She was in the midst of a delusion, whether there was cognitive dysfunction or not. I do question how we use this criminal law in our courtrooms with mentally ill defendants. Next, please. I'm sorry, I have so much more to say about that, but I know this went very fast. In 2001, she was found not insane. And in 2006, because of the prosecution's testimony, she had an appeal. The conviction was reversed. And she remains in a forensic psychiatric unit. Next, please. And of course, it's not over, because if one does not fulfill the specifics of the McNaughton insanity defense, then there is always the deific decree doctrine. So, March 2002, Andrea Yates, excellent mom, religious in Tyler, Texas, has the expert for prosecution and the same expert for the defense. Diana Laney in 2003, excellent mom, religious in Tyler, Texas, had the same expert for the prosecution and defense. However, Andrea Yates drowned her children, while Diana stoned her children to death. And Andrea had been directed by Staten, and Diana had been directed by God. Andrea was found to be sane not legally insane, and sent to prison. And in the deific decree doctrine, Deanna was found to be legally insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital. Next, please. So my question to you, to all of you, and I hope you will keep in mind, is as per the deific defense, can we distinguish the insane from the criminal by whether the biochemicals in their brain are speaking to them through God or Satan? If impaired cognition is associated with psychosis, is it appropriate to use a law that's based on cognition? How do we apply a 21st century model of psychiatry to the 1843 case of McNaughton? And I assume all of you know that history of McNaughton, in that it was judges who were asked to go into another room to decide if a psychotic man knew right from wrong, or how could they determine if someone who was psychotic knew right from wrong? I guess the question was just ask them. Next, please. Now, the problem, of course, for this, in asserting an insanity defense, the defense attorney must have two types of evidence. He must have a documented diagnosis and must have an awareness of the woman's behavior. Now, there is no diagnosis because, as we know, postpartum psychosis is not in the DSM. Next, please. And this is why I have had prosecutors come up to me on the stand and say, Dr. Spinelli, isn't it true that postpartum psychosis is not a formal DSM-5 psychosis? So the fact that postpartum psychosis is denied a status of diagnosis in psychiatry is an injustice that weakens its diagnostic credibility in the criminal court for mentally ill women. Next, please. Can we connect a 160-year-old case of McNaughton? Can we connect that or measure it against 21st century neuroscience? Next, please. This is a journal article in the Journal of Insanity, which has since become the American Journal of Psychiatry. The article is from 1854 about bloodletting in mental disorders. This was published within the same year that McNaughton was decided. Next, please. Psychiatric medicines have now replaced bloodletting, but McNaughton endures. Next, please. Can we apply our 21st century biopsychosocial model of psychiatry to the case of McNaughton? Next, please. Can we continue to put these women in jail for life because there were biological factors that they had no power over? These mothers are punished for psychiatric illness, and these women continue to be punished and will continue to be punished until we make changes both in medicine and in the law. I apologize that I rushed through that. I'm sorry, but the time was very tight. So thank you very much. I wanted to thank you for inviting me, but also thank you all for being interested in the subject.
All right, I did stop the screen share. I hope that was okay.
Yes.
Oh, that was a lot. I think we have some questions. Actually, I will turn it over. I need a minute to just breathe all the stuff in. That was incredible. Whew.
Yeah, that was a lot. But for me, it was inspirational because it also shows why it's important for us to do the work on our ground and why we must stand with directly impacted folks and folks that are harmed in all aspects of the world, and why we need to support and invest them, and why we need to invest in communities that are struggling the most. So I was really inspired, even while I'm currently building out the community pantry for us to give women and children food and resources for free. And it just motivated me more because people need this and many more safe housings for children. They need, whether a mother doesn't want to be a mom anymore, we need to figure out where can that child go that doesn't cause further harm. And we need to be able to support that mom with that transition open-heartedly and not with judgment. So there was so many things that I learned from y'all presentation, and I appreciate y'all for presenting. And I wanted to open it up for whoever had questions. I didn't see anybody in the chat drop questions. Oh, there's a question in the chat. You can come off mute, Pauline and Terry, if you want to ask. It does say, what can we do to help pass a bill in Massachusetts?
I guess I can respond to that, if that's okay. Well, and I so appreciate the mother and child bill that had been put forth in this legislative session. It did not pass. And I think by many of you who are attending today, and the Women's Bar Association Foundation and all the co-sponsors getting behind this legislation that was introduced by Representative O'Day. If you're on, I certainly want to give a shout out to you and to Senator Lovely and others that were were instrumental in putting it forward. I don't think Massachusetts was quite ready, but I think next term, and hopefully in the next year, we can get it passed, and Massachusetts can be the second state and the one to have a comprehensive postpartum criminal law, so that other states can follow, and that we can in the United States follow what all of these other countries are doing, and sort of really make headway to align ourselves with those kinds of rules, rather than sending women with a temporary mental illness to spend their life in prison. So anything you can do, I think, by showing support on these bills or getting behind it, I think those things are very important.
If I may add to that, another thing you can do is we do have several clients in our clemency project waiting for representation who are currently incarcerated for crimes similar to these. So if you're inspired and moved, we have plenty of cases that are already placed with attorneys and attorney teams.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Recently, I collected 50,000 signatures. Some of those vignettes were from a petition that I put out so that women who experience postpartum psychosis and their families could write in asking for postpartum psychosis to be placed into the DSM. I don't know, but is it possible for you to get names, a petition to go into the courts from women, families asking for, and attorneys asking for this?
Or into the legislature to send names to the legislature, because, in fact, when I testified in the Judicial Committee, there weren't that many people testifying on this particular bill. It was basically Representative O'Day and Senator Lovely and myself. I think that if there's more awareness and more support, then it might fly in the future, and it would be very important I think Massachusetts is ready for this.
Well, I do note it is just about 3:45. And
Oh, okay.
if anybody has more questions for the doctors, Feingold or Spinelli or Sashi about the work that she's doing here in Boston, feel free to stay on. Otherwise, I will.
There
talk
is
to
a
them.
question in the
Okay.
chat box
Okay.
from somebody from O'Day's office.
Oh yeah, it says please write to your legislators too. That I guess that would be just to encourage the bill to be.
Okay.
I do have just a quick question. I know we gotta go. First, I want to uplift Lola's comment because we have a lot of women that need support on clemency, and we need lawyers to help us back us up. We need all hands on deck. A lot of women have suffered inside of Framingham and have been incarcerated for many years because our communities, specifically my community, does not have access to resources to really get to the root issues of why people are harming each other. And so we really need y'all support with helping women who have just been buried inside of prisons for many years. And we just need y'all hands on deck. And so please reach out to Lola if you want to help the team. And then this could be the last question, but I just wanted to know, just for my own sake, Susan and Margaret, for what we're doing on the ground is like trying to figure out how transgression stop to begin with, right? Like, so if a person causes harm to a child, would you recommend, what we've been trying to do is have transformative justice conversations, which we go straight to the source of the person who may have caused harm to a child and figured out, like, what was the reason you did that? What did you need so you didn't cause harm? Like, what did we miss? Like, did you need community? Did you need finances? Like, what were you harmed? Like, what happened? Do you think that's a good approach from the community's perspective? Because as an organization that's on the ground, we do get a lot of backlash from that. Just because they're like, it could cause harm to their case, and which we are fully confidential. We don't like go run like, this is what she said to me, but we're just trying to prevent the next woman from, throwing her baby in the trash, or the next woman from causing harm, or, any transgression that's going to happen. We're just trying to stop the cycle. And do you think that is a good approach, just with y'all being the experts?
I think from a social perspective, it is a very good approach. In addition, you can also find out if there's a mental illness, if there are socioeconomic problems. I think we might have to turn that over to the attorneys, though, because I don't know what kind of information that can come out and be a problem for her case. And I guess that's what, Sashi, I guess that's what the attorneys are saying to you.
Yeah. So I guess the other thing I would say is that, maybe we have to back up also in terms of prevention and what we can do to identify women that are having trouble during pregnancy or who are at high risk, and get them identified, screened, and identified early so that they can get treatment, and we don't have to start when they're already incarcerated. Like, what we'd like to do is identify them and get them into treatment and prevent any babies or children or anyone from being harmed. And that's, it's a big order, but I think that's where we also need to focus on how we can do that.
I would like to also ask the lawyers about, if I ever say to anybody, well, you have this old law from 1853, oh, it's case law. I don't know what that means. I understand it's case law, but can anything be changed in the law? Can anything such as that, I know it's only half of the states, can this law be changed?
There are a lot of very smart lawyers on here, so I hope they'll jump in. I'm looking at Margaret. Is Jamie still here? And Janet? Janet's still here.
This might be also a sort of a way to start the next session when we do this again. And, I know my partner, attorney Barry Lewis, was willing to do a presentation. He's giving me a dirty look as I'm saying that. No, I'm sorry, but that might be a good question to present and spend some more time on. If that law can be changed, and why is it that we're stuck on that, and yet in the UK, where this came from, I believe, that they still make an exception for women who have given birth, who are lactating, that they found a roundabout. So can we do that in this country? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just saying. So
I will take this as an opportunity to invite everybody to join us for our next presentation, which will be by your partner. And I'm not sure if you'll be joining. We'll sort all of that out. Susan, we'll send out all the information. So thanks everyone for coming. Stay tuned. We've got plenty more. If this is your first time attending one of these panels, I hope you enjoyed it as much as the last one. And if this is your second time, because I think this is our second one so far, we will have a third in the fall, and we're going to be bridging the gap between the mental illness and criminal defense and how it works for the clemency cases. So please stay tuned, stay involved, and stay informed. And if you're inspired to take a case, absolutely, please be in touch. And you will hear from me via email. The link to the recording will be sent shortly.
Thank you.
thank you all for attending.
Bye, y'all. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.